Thank you. So with that, I would like to tell you that you can move to the next slide, please. So what is at stake in terms of ICT, accessible ICTs for education? Next slide, please. One thing that I took from one of the global monitoring reports from UNESCO is that people with disabilities are often invisible in official statistics. And so I think the demographic data points I would like to share with you really focus on that issue. How many students are in classrooms around the world live with disabilities, and what's happening in terms of dealing with their needs? Next slide. So I will take one case study, which is the case study of the United States. The reason is not because particular situation there, but just because they have very detailed statistics following early legislation in the 1990s, where they have to actually provide detailed count on how many students benefit from special education services. And the only observation I would like to make is that in general, we find a similar level of magnitude in those numbers. So the numbers you will see are probably similar in many different countries. Next slide. So in the United States, you can see from 1980 to today, the percentage of students enrolled in special education programs has evolved now to kind of level off at about 13% of the population of students. So it means 1 of 7 children, essentially, is today in the classroom with a disability in public schools in the United States. And so let me go to the next slide to show you the details. When you look at the 13.2% of the population in 2009 that were enrolled in special education program, so 5% is specific learning disabilities, and then the rest, or 8% more or less, are kind of broken down in other form of disabilities. Next slide. So the next slide will show you kind of a specific kind of graphical form of what that means. So you see that if you take just the total population of students with disabilities, almost that pie of 32% of students, 42% actually have learning disabilities, 19% speech and language impairments, 6% autism, 7% emotional disturbance, 8% intellectual disability, and 11% other health impairments. So that gives you a picture, a complete picture of what's happening today in the mainstream public schools in America. I doubt very much that those statistics are fundamentally different elsewhere, but the reality is that many countries do not identify those numbers in terms of the process by which students are diagnosed with specific disabilities. Next slide, please. So in relation to that background, you have a fundamental change that has occurred since 2006 with the launch of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and especially its Article 24. And that is, Article 24 defines the right for students to actually have access to inclusive, quality, and free primary and secondary education. Now, the word inclusive is really important. Next slide, please. Because it means that as you take students with disabilities and try to accommodate them as much as possible in mainstream classrooms, you need to provide reasonable accommodation in that context. Next slide. And that, of course, that must be provided within the general education system. So it means, every single school, every single class must actually be able to cope with the issue of accommodation of students with disabilities. Next slide. So the convention furthermore says that requires to facilitate the learning of Braille, sign language, and alternative forms of communications. So I point out to the alternative forms of communication because as you saw from the statistics, a number of students have either live with learning disabilities or other forms of disabilities, which makes their, for example, their reading or speech or their writing very difficult. It's a majority of students, in fact, with disabilities. And for that, as you will hear during this panel today, there are some very well proven effective assistive technology solutions that are available out there. But in the vast majority of cases, they aren't used, they are not available. Next slide. So the last point is equal access to general tertiary education with reasonable accommodation also needs to be provided. So that means universities and colleges have the same obligations. Next slide. So is it working? So again, let's look at some of the statistics that the Department of Education publishes in the US. In 2008, 62% of students with learning disability spent 80% or more of their in-school time in general education classrooms. In 2000, that was just 40%. So in other terms, 10 years ago, it was less than half of the students were in general classrooms, students with disabilities. Today it's 60%. It's progressing quite well. During the same period of time, the high school dropout rate among students with learning disabilities went actually down from 40% in 1999 to 22% in 2008. So it looks like something is working for students with learning disabilities, big time. Next slide. And also more students with learning disabilities are graduating with a regular high school diploma, 64% in 2008, up from 52% 10 years before. So again, as you see, the strategy of inclusive education, which is highly controversial in many countries because people don't understand how it can be implemented and the merit of it, is actually working extremely well from just a macro numbers standpoint. Next slide. One note, of course, that may or may not be generally aware, but male students comprise almost 2/3 of school-age students with learning disabilities that receive special education services. Next slide. So is technology actually used to serve those students or not? And there is a very long longitudinal transition study in the US that's being done year after year after year after year. And it shows that only 6% of students with learning disabilities were using a computer for activities when the computer use was not allowed for other students. So that's very important. It means that in many situations, educators do not want to let the student with a disability to use a computer when the other kids don't. So that's a big problem because many assistive technologies are computer dependent. Although now, maybe with this thing here, we will have a different set of attitude progressively changing. So that's, I was just showing a tablet for those remote participants. So maybe the technology will become more, common and less threatening that, that student is using a tablet, the other guy is not, So, but right now it's a huge issue. And then only 8% of students with disabilities, with learning disabilities, were using recorded text such as books on tape, and just 1% were using computer software designed for students with disabilities. It's impressive, right? 99% did not. Whereas there are tools for that. And then quite a while ago, in 1999, a researcher, Diane Golden, estimated that only 25 to 35% of students with learning disabilities were using any type of assistive technology to support their instruction. Next slide. Furthermore, it looks like teacher training and support is not that great. 60% only of students have general education teachers who receive any information about their needs. And only half of all students have teachers who receive advice from special educators that know how to meet their needs. So it means really half of the students are in no man's land in terms of support for their specific needs as students with disabilities. Next slide. So what does the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, say about that? Well, it says staff training requirements are pretty strict for state parties. It says, you need to employ teachers, among other things, that live with disabilities and are qualified in sign language and Braille, for example, for students who need it. But also, more generally, train professional staff who work at all levels of education on disability awareness, the use of assistive technologies and alternative format of communication, and the educational techniques that support persons with disabilities. So that is what is Article 24 of the Convention, and that is the ultimate goal for all national educational systems around the world. Next slide. So what are the challenges and opportunities? Obviously, from what we have seen, and certainly the report that UNESCO is launching today would reflect that, one of the big issues is how to train and support all educators to use existing IT solutions. Again, you have plenty of solutions. Some of them are open source. Take screen readers, for example. You can use NVDA. It's free. Just download it from the internet. It's available in 24 languages. You can use the DAISY format. There are a lot of kind of technology out there that actually are available at really no cost. But most importantly, people don't know it's out there, don't know how to use and don't know how to train the kids or the students to do it. So, second thing is, we see that a lot of issues are there around the lack of identification of issues in the classroom. In other terms, many students will be qualified as lazy or problematic or stubborn or aggressive or whatever, when in fact they are just living with a learning disability which is highly frustrating to them because they just can't keep up with the class. Maybe it's a reading disability, maybe it's a speech impairment of some sort. So what technology tools could help educators further identify disabilities in a more mainstream fashion? That's a question that is still open. Next slide. There are some new technology drivers. We just mentioned the tablets, but mobile is getting in the classroom. There was a very interesting report just issued by McKinsey & Company for the GSM Association, the Association of Mobile Service Providers using the GSM standard, showing how mobile is going to be, omnipresent in classrooms. When we had the meeting at UNESCO last November, and several of us were there was a very interesting observation, which is that about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, calculators were prohibited in the classroom. You could not use a calculator if you were in a primary school to do your math, your arithmetic work. Now, if you go into any public school in the United States, you get in the classroom, what's on the left side of the door is a big bucket which is full of calculators that kids can take whenever they want. So there was a huge change of attitude, for example, for calculators. And the best guess is maybe you will see a similar change of attitude when tablets, for example, become so widespread and so popular, and people will see the obvious advantage of those to use them and let kids use it. There is also cloud-based computing, which Yuta, I'm sure, will talk about a bit later, which presents some huge opportunities for education systems, both for resources but also for assistive technology or individualized solution in the cloud, which can be actually then called upon from the school, from transportation, or from the home. And then to that point, can individualized communication and learning tools automatically adjust to the needs of the students? That is the big promise long-term of technology, I think, which is that, in effect, to be most helpful to students. One would imagine a solution where the system knows what you need and just deliver it the way you need to. Next slide. One issue, of course, today in the current situation is that assistive technologies remain very much linked, the availability linked to income. We do a survey at G3ict once a year of the country's level of implementation of the Convention for ICTs. And one thing we have noticed when we do cost tabulation of results by income per capita, the worldwide average is 59% of the countries do have assistive technologies available at universities. But if you break it down by level of income per capita, it's 82% in developed countries and 25% in least developed countries. So there is a clear relationship between income per capita and availability of assistive technologies, which, by the way, may or may not be strictly linked to the cost of it, to the cost of the hardware or the software, although it is certainly a factor. But a lot of it has to do also with the lack of knowledge and the lack of capacity to actually, implement those assistive technologies, which is actually a big budget expense. In other terms, as you talk about assistive technologies, the training and support component is quite often far greater than the cost of the equipment or the software. Next slide. So, in conclusion, what we identified when we had that UNESCO expert group meeting last November, which was really important, is that the reason why you really want to focus on education is that, and delivering those assistive technology solutions, you want to help students with disabilities learn by themselves which technology works for them and how to use it to learn, work, and interact with others. In other terms, if you can help a young person at school really become self-advocates, say, well, this is what I need to be successful, this is the type of technology, this is the type of screen reader I can work with, then they will apply that same skills to the workplace anywhere later in life. So also the support for the students should really, if possible, transition seamless from the education system to the workplace. And there are some good case studies around the world that show that if there is a good bridge organized between the education system and the first workplace, it can be quite successful. So thank you for your attention. I hope I gave you a sense of the scope of the issue. 13% of the population in public schools in America are actually benefiting from special education services. Those special education services are dearly required if you want to have a successful inclusive education strategy, which is not a mandate of the convention and actually UNESCO strategy. And if you want to have accommodation, you need assistive technologies and inclusive and accessible ICTs in the classroom. Thank you.
So thank you, Axel, for this overview, and it's very, very interesting, and provides a clear understanding of the scope of the program we're talking about. So now let me turn to the next speaker, Mr. Olaf Mittelstadler.